This is an odd subject to talk about, various kinds of audiences. So I'm going to tell you what I'm assuming in terms of this audience, and this is going to be fairly informal. This is about the size group that I expected. And I'm going to assume that what we have in this room are mostly scientists and engineers. And that most of you have some sort of background, otherwise you probably wouldn't be at GTRI, much less here, with regard to the military and technology in the military and sort of national security domain. And that you have such interests, and that hidden among you may actually be some Civil War buffs, but that everybody in the room knows something about the Civil War. And the work that I've done is actually a fairly extensive and serious study, but we'll keep this fairly informal. And I've been accused by no less a person than the chief military historian of the Smithsonian of studying history like an engineer. But he actually said that in a positive sense. A number of historians don't care much for that because of the way I set up problems. But I assume I'm not going to have much of a problem with this group. And what I will do over the course of this hour, and then at 1 o'clock we all run downstairs and pick up whatever food's left over from the meeting downstairs. But I will set up the problem. I am open to interference. On this particular subject, there's always someone who has their own 2 cents to put in. Frankly, that's welcome. And then, after essentially setting up the problem, or at least giving you some sense, fairly informally, of the structure of the problem and why I'm studying it, I'll go through, if you like, the 2 tracks that pervade this study with some examples. And what should come of this is an understanding that there are really quite a number of information technologies in the Civil War. There are a couple that are for the telegraph, the electric telegraph in particular, that has been much studied in the Civil War. It has a role in our discussion, but does not dominate the way other studies of technology in the Civil War portray it. Let me also point out that we're here at Georgia Tech. We are actually physically located on the site of part of the Battle of Atlanta. This is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And it would seem natural for us to do something beyond this little discussion here with regard to technology and that war at this time and at this place. And in April, we're actually going to have a symposium on campus. April 12th, for the whole day, on technology, maybe called Engineering the Civil War, or something like that. And some of us feel that we can't let a sesquicentennial go by here without dealing with this much more seriously. Let me just point out a couple of things that even most buffs of the Civil War don't fully appreciate. This was the most singular war in our history. And I'll say something about scaling, and a certain aspect of scaling actually has motivated this study. We had a population of about 30 million people in 1860, of which 9 million went to the South. And of those 9 million, close to 4 million were slaves. And most of those people, as you might imagine, were rooting for the other side. During the course of the 4 years of that war, 750,000 soldiers died. And there was more physical destruction in this country. And there was more deaths on an absolute scale, not a relative scale, a 10th population scale, on an absolute scale, than of all of our other wars put together. It is the most singular 4 years in the history of this country, and the consequences are still very much felt. From a military standpoint, and after all, it was a war of the kinds of magnitude and consequences that I've just hinted at with a few statistics. Let me describe the U.S. Army in 1860 very briefly. And I do this at least partly to motivate the study. In 1860, we had one army in this country. By 1861, we had two, obviously. That army in 1860 had 16,000 men in it. The largest unit was a regiment. Regiments in its various forms were divided into companies and infantry companies and artillery batteries and cavalry troops. And typically one of these company-sized units had about 100 men in it. Most of these 16,000 men were in fixed or relatively stationary locations, forts along the coast, or in various places west of the Mississippi beating up on the Native Americans. By the summer of 1864, our next summer, 150 years back, Billy Sherman paid a visit to Atlanta. Billy Sherman brought with him what in World War II terms would be called an Army group. An Army group is 6 orders of magnitude, if you like, 6 orders of magnitude organizationally beyond a regiment or a company. And to remind you of this scaling, which is fundamental to the discussion that we're going to have here. An Army group consists of at least 2 armies. A field army, and we'll define a field army a little bit more carefully in just a few minutes, consists of at least 2 corps. A corps consists of at least 2 divisions. It should not be news to everybody here, but I'm trying to make a point about the scaling that took place over the course of a year or 2. A division consisted of at least 2 brigades. And finally, a brigade consisted of at least 2 regiments, and we've just gone back to the organizational level that existed in 1860. So in the 3 years, roughly, or 4 years, from 1860 to 1864, when Sherman came down here, we went from an army of 16,000 men to the first really big war of the industrial era. And over the course of that war, 3 million men served in the 2 armies. The fundamental field unit, as the name would imply, is the field army. Define a field army, you can define it in various ways, but these were the fundamental operational units of that war. And a field army contained large numbers of men in the units of the 3 primary combat arms of the time. It's the infantry, the artillery, and the cavalry, all of which still have counterparts today. Of these, actually, the cavalry is, especially technologically, gone through the greatest change. We could have a similar discussion, by the way, about navies, but there's only so much anybody can tolerate from me on this kind of discussion. And in addition to those large units, corps and divisions and what have you, composed of these combat arms units. A field army had all sorts of, if you like, technical branches, we would call today, that made them able to function for extended periods of time in various circumstances out in the field for literally years at a time, which is not something people think about in today's military. We did, Vietnam may have been the last time we did anything like that, where we'd have division-sized units or corps-sized units and what have you serving for years at a time. And those other, if you like, technical branches consisted of a headquarters structure, medical units, commissary units, quartermaster units, ordnance units, signal units. Particular relevance to this topic is that the Signal Corps, which I think has funded a whole bunch of stuff over here in one form or another, and which has, I guess, its command and school out near Augusta, Fort Gordon. Both armies created Signal Corps during this war. Interestingly enough, the Confederate Army created its Signal Corps first. And so the issue that is the essence of this study is that we've had this scaling up, this unprecedented scaling up. There's nothing like it before. There was something sort of halfway decent in the Mexican War, but it was really quite trivial compared to what we're talking about now. And there's been nothing like it since. The relative scaling from 1860 to 1864 was much greater, especially given what the country was like in the mid-19th century, than what happened from when we went from whatever we had in 1940 to whatever we had by 1944 and World War II. In 1860, you had no clue what a future U.S. Army might look like. By 1865, we could see what the future U.S. Army was going to look like for the next 100 years. So the issue with regard to command, control, and communications is you had this very rapid scaling, and not only did you have this rapid scaling, but you went from essentially an uncontested peacetime army in 1860, the poor Native Americans west of the Mississippi threatened nothing, supply lines, whatever, to a full-scale war, the most vicious and intense war we have ever had in the history of this country. And the scaling had to take place under those circumstances in a very short time interval. And so the issue that is behind CQ is how do the people who own these field armies, okay, and the most important of these should be recognizable to all of you. There are about 20 of them altogether, with 6 or 8 being particularly well known. In the East, it was the Army of the Potomac and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Out here, it was the Army of Tennessee, which is the Confederate Army, and the Army of the Tennessee, which was a federal army, and other armies like the Army of the Ohio and the Army of the Cumberland. Those 3 actually are what were here in 1860. By the way, we have an alum in Charlie Crawford, a retired Air Force colonel, very loyal Georgia Tech alum, who is also president of the Georgia Battlefield Association, who has done all kinds of studies, including mapping and what have you, of what this place looked like in 1864. There was not much combat here because the Confederate defenses were actually quite strong. And sure, there's just one little plaque, okay, in the center of campus, near the tower, that describes the 2 forces that essentially faced each other with very little combat. during, if you like, the Battle of Atlanta. Just as an aside, and I hope you don't all mind if I get off track here and there. I mean, this is small. I mean, if you want something much more formal, why not? I'm glad to do that. But I'd like to bring up some local stuff that some of you might be sensitive to. But Charlie has given talks. Actually, we had a very large audience for a talk that he gave as part of the library program on what happened here in Atlanta more generally in terms of maps and actions. He's given walking tours. We organized them. Frankly, it's part of a course that I teach as an overload with John Miller on the Civil War. So, the question is, how do you operate a field army? In the first large-scale war of the industrial era, where there is incredibly little experience on the part of the officers who are in command of these armies. And the people whose names, all this talk about all these West Point type guys who became the leading generals on both sides, most of these people, whatever combat experience they had, was in the Mexican War about 15 years earlier. And what needs to be remembered is that West Point put out lieutenants, people who could operate at the company level. In the Civil War, there were no platoons or whatever. I mean, every so often that word is used, but really the company was, 100 men was the minimal unit, the battery was the artillery equivalent, the troop was the cavalry equivalent. And so people like Grant, Lee was actually a more senior person. I think he might have been a lieutenant colonel. It's actually Jefferson Davis, who was the senior ranking guy who went through the Civil War during the Mexican War. He was a West Point graduate. A lot of military experience. Jefferson Davis actually was Secretary of War for the United States. As opposed to Abraham Lincoln, who commanded a militia company in the Black Hawk War. So every West Point graduate, including all sorts of people who really dropped out for various reasons, like U.S. Grant, basically were brought back into the Army and made colonels because of a complete lack of any kind of experience, certainly including command experience, to deal with this scale up that ultimately by 1864 went to the Army Group level. And so the issue and the cause of a lot of grief during especially the first year of the war is how do you operate something at the Army level when for the first time you're organized at the Army level and no one has any experience, and all of a sudden you're equipping hundreds of thousands of people with all kinds of advanced weaponry of the time, which became more advanced during the course of the war. And who runs these things, these field armies? And how do you run them in such a way that they actually accomplish what they're supposed to accomplish? Which in one case was to break the country in half and create a whole separate new country, or in the other case, to keep it together. And this is one of these no-compromise wars where neither side could basically give in to the other side. They were two totally incompatible end results, primary goals. So this was going to be fought to the point where one side or the other won. And ultimately, as I mentioned before, you're going to have 8 million people, 3 million people, fighting mostly in these field army units. Some definitions. And again, we're not going to get all that far in this, but hopefully I can pique your interest or what have you, and we can follow this up in some other way. But frankly, I just love this subject. I just picked it up, sort of something I was interested in as a kid. And Sputnik went up when I was in junior high, and I got distracted into all kinds of other things. And now, as an old person, I'm coming back to the childhood interest. And during a period when I was particularly fed up with what was going on in this institution, and was looking for something entertaining to do. And I got really interested in this. A couple of definitions. We defined the field arguments. How about a definition of technology? Anybody? We all make our living, right? On that word. It was, by the way, I'll make a few side comments. I'm just going to babble on here until 1 o'clock, and you can interrupt when you want. Then we'll just call it quits. But just a few little odds and ends here. How about a definition of technology, which was not a term used at the time very much?
Application of science.
No, that was totally wrong for that time. Okay. Technology was mostly invention. Most of technology at the time was not all that specifically and explicitly science-based. That came later. That's certainly true now. It was not true when this institution was created. You can have a whole lot of technology without much of a science base. Although there was some. By this time in the Industrial Revolution, there was some scientific basis. Mostly in the form of Newtonian mechanics. But most of the practitioners weren't all that explicitly aware of that. But how about a definition of technology? By the way, engineers were mostly civil engineers. People who did other things were called inventors.
It's mostly related to tools, right? Things that you use that are not your own hands to accomplish some outcome.
Okay. That could be a piece of it. I'm looking for a definition that actually is going to explicitly include what I'm talking about. Also explicitly includes a whole lot of stuff that we implicitly or explicitly think of as technology today.
Weapons?
Well, weapons is a piece of it. But technology is much broader than that. In the 1860s, frankly, throughout the entire 19th century, technology was changing the very essence of Western society. Actually, I'm going to teach a whole course on that. And it relates to weapons next semester. So all kinds of things were happening as a result of technology, much more generally in society than just weapons. The argument is that weapons in many ways were taking advantage of other things that were developed in society. And the military more generally was taking advantage of these technologies for the purposes of fighting war. So, for example, railroads did not exist in Napoleon's time. They were really important during our Civil War. The military did not develop railroads at all. Okay? Here in the U.S., but especially in Britain, a few other countries, France, Russia, railroads were developed. By the time our Civil War came around, people realized, for a whole bunch of reasons that we really won't go into here, that railroads were going to be crucial to fighting this war. And there they were. In this huge landmass where the Civil War was fought, it was comparable to the landmass where the Napoleonic Wars were fought. Okay. We had a country that was pretty well networked with railroads. A gift of an earlier stage of the Industrial Revolution, that actually during the Civil War, railroads is off the subject anyhow, I just want to monitor, as long as you're prepared to listen, I'm just going to enjoy myself here. But railroads basically wired the country in a way that enabled all kinds of other second period industrial revolution kinds of technologies to be effectively brought to bear to fight this war. Any other definitions of technology? Technology is not part of your name. Part of the tech name, more generally.
Well, it's like techniques or methods, new methods of
Okay,
Of
getting closer.
transportation.
Getting closer.
okay.
Or at least to my definition. I'm not trying to get you to sort of read my mind here. Let me move on since we're going to run out of time before I say much anything, to be perfectly honest with you. I define technology, and I think it's consistent with most modern definitions, as know-how. Know-how to conceive of, to design, to build, manufacture, to maintain and use useful products. And sometimes products and processes. It's very important to include processes. And sometimes the word technology is applied to the products and processes themselves. Processes. And so you take, I mentioned that this war, and this is actually relevant to the subject that we're probably never going to really get to by the time 1 o'clock rolls around. But take something like a typical signal corps unit. And a signal corps unit, which is very important to the information flows that I essentially define CQ to be. And take a signal corps unit, and a field signal corps unit typically consisted of 3 or 4 people, 1 officer. It had, if you like, technical products in it. And those products would consist of flags. Okay. Everybody knows what the Signal Corps emblem looks like. Okay. It comes out of the Civil War. Okay. White flag with a red square on it, or a dark flag with a white square on it. Right? A cross. Only 1 flag at a time was actually used. One of the improvements, frankly, over the Napoleonic semaphore signaling that a fellow by the name of Myers, a colonel in the U.S. Army, put together. Actually, he was working on this before the Civil War, before there was any signal corps. But basically, a signal man used one of these flags. Depending on background or what have you, you either use the white or the dark background flag. Okay, so that could be seen from another side. Okay. Other technology that was part of the unit's equipment were binoculars and telescopes, which, by the way, both came significant. Binoculars essentially didn't exist in the Napoleonic Wars. Back almost in Galileo's time, people thought of these things, but the technology was not far enough along for binoculars to be then used until the American Civil War, where they became enormously important. Other things that a small signal unit would have were torches. It's a form of technology. Okay? A product that served a certain function. Somebody thought of a way to put together torches so they would stay lit for a certain amount of time or what have you. And these were used instead of flags when it was dark or cloudy out. There are other forms of product technology in a typical little signal corps unit, like a book of codes and ciphers. And so there were these product forms of technology, but there are also process forms of technologies in this little unit. This discussion can be extended to virtually any Civil War unit that was technology going. And these processes consisted of procedures whereby the unit would set itself up, how it would signal in ways that could be understood by other units, how to break itself down and go someplace else, how basically to operate in the field. I would contend that all of that, those processes and the products themselves, are technology. And again, it's very important to consider process as part of technology, because products by themselves don't have the kind of impact we usually associate with technology. And the word know-how tends to encompass all of this quite well. And this definition, I think, is very useful if you ask someone to define technology in terms of concepts. So it gets all kinds of things like software, into the picture. Okay. Just as an aside, again another aside, the word technology, there were 4 major institutes of technology created in the 19th century. We are one of them. All were created in quite different ways. Only one of them was created as an institute of technology. That's how rarely the word was used. By the way, that was MIT. And it was created as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1861. It did not actually produce a class of any consequence during the course of the war. Anybody, there's another little side here, what's the oldest of the 4 19th century? There were a whole bunch of others created, but 4 have continued to this day as the institutes of technology around this country. What do you think is the oldest of the 4? Obviously predates 1861. By the way, West Point was our first engineering school. It was not called an Institute of Technology. Jefferson actually quite explicitly created it with the thought of it being an engineering school. And most of the really good graduates that come out of West Point and went into the Civil War were engineers and fought for the North. It's the dummies who are cavalrymen who showed up on the southern side. What's the oldest institute of technology among the 4? 3 of them are pretty obvious. There's one, the oldest actually is probably the last one to come to your mind. Rensselaer. It was created as the Rensselaer School in 1824. And again, technology was not part of the name. Considerably before MIT. What was the next one? Us. 1885. We were created on this site, it was actually between the lines of the Battle of Atlanta. We were not called the Georgia Institute of Technology at the time. It was 1948, I'm sorry, that we were called the Georgia Institute. This can be checked. I may not be remembering this correctly. And we were created as part of the New South. Right? The Southern economy was destroyed during the war. Atlanta in particular had some notable problems during the course of the war. During the war, it was burned twice. Anybody know the 3rd time Atlanta was burned? 1917. There was a fire in this town. It was actually during World War I, but it wasn't caused by World War I, obviously. And the phoenix rising out of the ashes actually refers to that burning, rather than the 2 burnings during the Civil War. One of the burnings of the Civil War was really by the Confederates, the other was Sherman before he left. The 4th burning, of course, was during Gone with the Wind. And what is portrayed in that movie or in that book doesn't look like actually what happened during the war itself, which is bad enough in its own right. So we were the 3rd, and you know, the slave-based agriculture, cotton and tobacco-based economy of the South had to be replaced by something. It was partially replaced by a form of indentured servitude for the former slaves. Cotton still was king in some ways. But there were efforts, and a lot of it was centered here in Atlanta, to create a new South that was much more industrialized than the old South. And we are one of the manifestations of that semi-successful effort. And in some ways, we are perhaps the most successful single remaining part of that effort. And for whatever it's worth to you, what's the fourth Institute of Technology of still some note that was created during the 19th century? It was also not created as an Institute of Technology. It wasn't called that, at least.
Virginia A&M?
What?
Virginia A&M?
No. My alma mater, Caltech, which was called the Troop Institute. It was created by some of the very first Nobel Prize winners in physics, including Michelson. Michelson was actually the first Nobel Prize, U.S. Nobel Prize winner. And from the very beginning, it was a science-oriented as opposed to a technology-oriented. To this day, the technology that's done there tends to be really far-out stuff like Mars rovers and Curiosity, that kind of technology, rather than what is done the others. It remains tiny. But those are the four, and only one was actually called an Institute of Technology. So, let me return for a few minutes to the C-cubed aspects of this. So these things, again, I can define the three C's, which have since become C4ISR. And now I stopped looking at this stuff, really, when it was C4ISR. And I've never found a history of, by the way, how all of those letters gradually became concatenated. The term used in the Civil War of all those letters, 7 of them, was just command. Communications was used in a different sense, although partially in the modern sense. Control was hardly used whatsoever. The terms command and control were not used together, I think, until about World War I. Came C-cubed by World War II. And then all these other letters sort of came up while, the defense industrial complex, military industrial complex, needed things to do. And now I understand it's called, someone here can tell me better, it's called mission command, right? They got rid of all the letters. No, this is what some people at West Point told me about a month ago when I gave a variant to this talk.
It has yet to trickle down to the contract.
I see. But apparently the letters have gone away. So basically, I study this problem at various levels along two tracks. One is functional. What are these information flows supposed to be accomplishing? The other is technological. What technologies are brought to bear to enable the information flows to actually achieve their functional goals? And you can scale it. In the Civil War, it's easier to pull apart definitions of the three C's than it is today, or even was by World War II. I mean, it's not obvious where command ends and control starts. But I sort of separate them out. And you can actually look at information flows in one of these field armies, the Army of the Potomac, or what Sherman brought down here in his army groups, or the various Confederate armies. We know far more, by the way, about the Northern armies than the Confederate armies. And I can explain the reasons for that. It's not that the Confederates weren't trying, it's just that, the times weren't with them. But in any case, you can look at tactical level, which is largely command. You can look at the strategic level, because all of these armies had strategic elements to them. Okay? They're basically fighting a war for the nation's existence. And a lot of what they did was strategic in any sense of that word. And then these armies weren't totally self-contained. Okay? Certainly not given what that period of the Industrial Revolution looked like. And they had to have information flows with the outside world, with their presidents in Richmond or Washington, okay, with all of those factories that made the stuff that these armies consumed in vast quantities, or farms for that matter. And so there are actually three levels. And the levels conveniently, not exactly, and I won't go into this, divide up into tactical is mostly command, control is mostly strategic, and external is mostly communications, where in fact I use the term communications largely the way it was used during the war, supplemented by an understanding of how it's used. And let me end by giving you an example from all three of these categories: the tactical command, the control communications, and the external, the control strategic, and the external communications. I'll mention two battles at the tactical level. Tactical, basically, it's interesting. The historians don't like this, but engineers are perfectly fine with this kind of characterization. In terms of time and distance, tactical usually in the Civil War referred to timescales of minutes to a few days. And if you want to think about tactical in another way, take one of these field armies, draw a radius of 10 miles or 20 miles, defined by basically such things as artillery range or what cavalry could do in a fairly small amount of time or what have you. Draw a radius of, let's say, 20 miles around one of these field armies. And when two of these field armies got close enough together so that those little circles intersected, you had a tactical situation. They were close enough for the weaponry and the communications, including reconnaissance and what have you, the day to basically start shooting at each other. By the way, that's a larger distance scale than existed in the Poland. Significantly larger, and technologically enabled. We'll get to strategic and external in a bit, but I'll mention, by way of illustration, two battles and the different technologies that sort of appear, the relatively modern technologies, the sort of post-Napoleonic technologies that played a role in these two battles. And I'm going to assume most of you have some idea of what happened in these two battles. They're really very well known. They're on the east. I'll use a local Western to illustrate the strategic side. One was the Battle of Fredericksburg. For its time, this is in late 1862, second year of the war, and for its time, the Army of the Potomac was by far the most sophisticated and advanced army with regard to, if you like, communications technology in the world. And two of the features that made it really absolutely unique in that battle, with regard to information flows and if you like, information technologies, was one, the field telegraph, where you had units. I mean, everybody knows what telegraph is, right? Telegraph dates from about the 1840s. Okay. there was an extensive telegraph network in this country, both north and south, when the war started. But that telegraph infrastructure was fixed, and there had to be something to be done to bring the telegraph to the field army level in some kind of mobile way. And this is called the field telegraph. And you can load up wagons with about 5 miles worth of wire and batteries. Well, these people weren't idiots. There were a lot of smart people working on technology in this part of the Industrial Revolution. And the Army of the Potomac was really the only army of the time that actually had developed, or actually deploying, field telegraph to any great extent. It was awkward because you still had wires, but it could be used when you had fairly stable situations, not necessarily static situations, so you could actually wire one headquarters to another, let's say the Army or Corps level. You didn't have enough of this going on. Or from some headquarters, let's say, to an important position like a bridgehead or whatever. And the Army of the Potomac had this. The Army of the Potomac had something else during the Battle of Fredericksburg, and that is it had balloons. And it had telegraph wires going up to those balloons. This was really advanced. We had an aeronautics branch of the Union Army during, actually we sort of had one, the Confederate Army too. There's an interesting story there, but it was really quite substantial for a while, at least, in the Army of the Potomac.
What kind of balloons?
Basically a hydrogen-based gas would be generated by heating up certain kinds of metals that gave off a gas that would take a balloon up. Both sides use pretty much the same thing. The word hot air, if that's what you're asking. Although hot air balloons go back to the 1780s. And from the 1780s on, people were thinking about all the things you could use. I mean, it just became obvious to a number of people that adding a third dimension to the battlefield could actually make a difference. And so from the 1780s on, people were thinking of massive bombardments, moving huge numbers of troops, dropping leaflets, bombs, whatever. And especially observation. Nothing came of it till really our Civil War, when it became, and this is why it's relevant to it became primarily an observation platform. Hence information. And the Union Army of Fredericksburg had these things, and they had wires going up, or you could send messages down the tether ropes. There's no way to control these things. They're not like they were dirigibles. And so the Union Army, in addition to various other technologies that we won't go into, had these things at Fredericksburg. And it was, in a sense, wired for at least C squared, C cubed, like no other army before or since. And all of this was for naught. The Confederates under Lee basically used a very old Confederate Balloon Corps had basically disappeared by then, partly because they ran out of materials. The last Confederate balloon of note was made out of dresses of all the women of the Confederacy. It was captured by the North, and they were never able. I mean, the North, had they pursued balloons, could have actually run these things at the Corps level. The whole story as to why that didn't happen. But at Fredericksburg, basically, Lee was using essentially a Napoleonic scheme that, in fact, the Army of Northern Virginia had a lot of trouble working out. But by the end of 1862, they had worked out a combination of courier and messenger and what have you, kinds of scheme for communications. Basically, Burnside, the Union general, threw all his technical advantages away by some very stupid frontal attacks that resulted in enormous casualties and distressed Abraham Lincoln to no end, not to mention the whole country. It just goes to show you, you just screw up at the top level, your technological advantages amount to nothing. The second example that I'll raise, which is also the Northern Army of the Potomac, at which point they had pretty much given up on the field telegraph and balloons. But the Signal Corps got itself into pretty good shape. And the Battle of Antietam, which basically was the culmination of Robert E. Lee's move into Maryland. There's all sorts of reasons for doing that. McClellan was in charge of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan, among all the federal generals, was the most technology enamored. And the topographical circumstances of the Battle of Antietam were such that the Federals, who actually had quite a few signal units, this is in September of 1862, it was actually before Fredericksburg. And it was the battle that the North sort of won, and it encouraged Lincoln to go ahead with a preliminary proclamation that freed the slaves. It was the first step. And what happened was that the North positioned all of these small signal units in the mountains overlooking the entire valley where the battle was fought. And the Signal Corps got its act together really well. And they could see everything that was going on. There was no Confederate counterpart. And they were busy signaling other signal units that were closer to the actual field commanders. And they were telling everybody what was going on with both armies, and especially the Confederate Army, giving McClellan yet another huge advantage, in addition to basically capturing a copy of Lee's orders. Intelligent advantage of the first man. There were other advantages that the Army of the Potomac. There was never a battle in Civil War where one side had more basic technological or intelligence advantages than McClellan had at Antietam, including having a set of topographical engineers who figured out all kinds of things to better see what the hell was going on. But from our standpoint, for information flows, this was the most singular tactical case where the Signal Corps was in a position to provide reconnaissance and intelligence information that had some significant effects and could have been really quite decisive in this extremely important battle. And what happened was, and we have reports from the Confederates who could see what was going on there and were absolutely helpless to do anything about it. By this time, the Confederate Signal Corps had completely sort of and so they would see a Confederate column going someplace, they'd signal down, and Northern artillery, which was far superior to Southern artillery, would start shooting these people apart. Nevertheless, this did not prove decisive. And I think one of the reasons, and this is not terribly clear, one of the reasons was that the operational part of the Army was incapable of absorbing this advantage in an effective tactical way. The artillery people got fairly good at it. Okay? But the commanders of the other, particularly the cavalry, basically disappeared from the battlefield by this point in the war. Cavalry just could not survive given the weaponry. I mean, cavalry was really important in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon would have his horses basically beat the hell out of somebody at critical moments and whatever. That had completely disappeared by the Civil War. And I think the field commanders, the brigade commanders, the division commanders, the artillery in a larger sense, simply could not absorb, and even though there was near real-time signaling and translation and what have you, the time was just a little bit too slow, and there were no procedures worked out. And during the heat of the battle, I don't believe the northern actual on-the-ground commanders could absorb the information from this wonderful set of intelligence and reconnaissance advantages they had to actually make the most use of them in the battle. And ultimately, Lee got away. And we can talk about how other things could have happened in that battle that could have really made a big difference in that war. Before the end of 1862, drove Lincoln absolutely out of his mind. Lincoln, by the way, was a really, really bright guy. And he was about the fastest study of anything, of any senior executive we've ever had in this country. He was also gifted technically. The only president had the patent. And he's an interesting guy. Whenever a really attractive technology was, well, he understood it immediately, better than his generals. This goes for balloons, this goes for the monitor, this goes for all kinds of weapons and what have you. Trouble with Lincoln in the early part of his time in office, the only president, by the way, who served his entire term, or both terms in a sense, totally in wartime conditions. Only president. And when he realized, when he saw these various technological advantages, he was utterly powerless. It's amazing how many people ignored Lincoln. And it's hard to imagine today because he's pictured as, rightfully so, as one of the strongest presidents we've ever had. But people just blew him off all over the place. People in the Army during the first 2 years, especially. It actually took Grant to fully appreciate this guy as the commander-in-chief. And it actually took Lincoln to fully appreciate Grant, to be perfectly honest. So, in any case, the Army of the Potomac blew this incredible advantage, and it was never to be repeated. Just a little local comment on the Signal Corps. You all know we have this cyclorama in town, right? For the Battle of Atlanta. There was a period in the late 19th century when cycloramas were the rage. And they were made all over the world. So there's one on Waterloo in Belgium. There are more contemporary versions like the Stalingrad. We have two in this country. One in Gettysburg and one here. There were more made, a lot of them didn't survive. But just as a little Signal Corps kind of thing, there is in the middle of this raging battle a signal flag. It's one of the red squares against the white background. And it's shredded at the top of a tree. And this is what often happened with these little signal stations. Basically, they would seek height. And in fact, there was a book written in the 1890s basically describing the whole history of the Signal Corps during the war, big thick books like this. And a lot of these signal units basically used to climb trees. And so here is this tree that is clearly all shot up and what have you. And at the very top of this tree, in the middle of this raging battle, is this shredded signal flag. And the little caption that goes with it in the description of our cyclorama says something like, "The remains of a federal signal position." The signal people didn't always have it easy. And they were not largely appreciated. Let me just very briefly talk about strategic elements and bring this closer to home. Control, in my view, and in the kind of taxonomy I put together, is largely what is done to manage a field army when it's not in a tactical battle situation. So what's typically happening with these armies is that when they weren't static in camp, largely dying of disease, or they weren't in battle, They were moving. They were going somewhere. They were going somewhere to be in a better position for a forthcoming battle. They were moving for strategic reasons to block the enemy or to somehow do some kind of damage to the enemy other than a direct battle. But these armies moved around a lot. When you talk about time and distance at the strategic level, you are talking about times that are measured typically in weeks to months, as opposed to minutes to days. And you are talking about distances that can be a few hundred miles. Certainly at least 100 miles. So we're talking about order of magnitude changes in times and distances that define strategic. The most strategic movement of any set of armies during the course of the entire war were Sherman's three legs. In May of 1864, leg number 1 was a trip from Chattanooga here. Starting towards the end, not starting, but towards the end, ending literally in Christmas of 1864, was a movement from here to Savannah. The so-called March to the Sea. After that, Sherman took his armies of the Department of the Mississippi, they had long since left the Mississippi, and they moved from Savannah through South Carolina, where they beat the hell out of the South Carolinians. They didn't beat us up all that much. They really disliked the South Carolinians because it was those lunatics in South Carolina that started this whole. And ultimately, Sherman, and at that point he was commanding two army groups. One was off in Tennessee chasing after Hood, and then there was the one that went with him to Savannah and then ultimately ended up in the middle of North Carolina. So we had three major, unprecedented in terms of the size of the armies that were moving around and the geography that were covered. Three legs of this campaign of Sherman's that lasted from May of 64 until April of 65. And the three legs were really quite different. And the information flows were extremely different. And we're over time, and let me just sort of give you an idea of the differences in the three legs. And just a couple of words of how the information flows and the technologies behind them changed. The movement from Chattanooga here was seriously opposed by the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Sherman's three armies of the Cumberland, of the Ohio, and of the Tennessee, northern armies tended to be named after rivers, and southern armies tended to be named after regions. Army of the Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia. That wasn't absolute, but it certainly applies to most of the principal armies. Sherman comes down here with his army group and is seriously opposed. In terms of what at that time was called lines of communications, which are essentially connections to the outside world and along an army that was spread out geographically. Sherman had this very difficult problem of keeping his lines of communications, okay, for supplies, for literal, in our terms, communication, for ways of sending wounded back to safety and all this sort of stuff. Between here and Chattanooga, he was extremely dependent on the long-distance telegraph, which was used much more extensively than the field telegraph, and the railroad. And Sherman basically, from a staff problem and from a communications within the Army standpoint, largely abandoned the more sophisticated technologies, including the flag wavers. It was Thomas, okay, General Thomas of Rock of Chickamauga fame, who was the primary user of the Signal Corps. In fact, his army was the only one that had any number of signals. And there were only 200, an army of 200,000 that came down here. Three armies, only one of them had signal units of any consequence, and they only numbered 200 people. That was largely Thomas. And Thomas was the guy who was around here, by the way. It was the Army of the Cumberland, who was stationed for a while here. In any case, the characterization of the information flow problems basically was twofold. One is Sherman, who was just superb at this. He was the best control guy of either army. And he could communicate. He had all these troops in 3 armies running all over the place. And he maintained, using largely Napoleonic kinds of technologies and processes, he maintained superb contact with all his unit commanders. Using the railroad and the telegraph, he maintained extraordinarily effective, even though they were attacked frequently, but really very effective. He was extremely dependent on the connection to Chattanooga for supplies. The most significant form of supplies, by the way, in that period of the industrial era was ordnance. There were other kinds of things, food for horses, for people, what have you, that you could pick up locally, but not ordnance. And ordnance is bulky and heavy. And you absolutely needed the railroad for that. And he managed to protect those lines of communications and use those forms of transportation and communications more effectively than just about anyone. He also understood Confederate dependencies. The reason Atlanta fell is because he cut one railroad after another, and his control, his tactical command aspect, what he did to finally basically cut Atlanta off and forced Hood and the Army of Tennessee to withdraw, is he cut the last railroad line in Chattanooga. In Jonesboro, I'm sorry. Okay. And he did this with this big end run. And interestingly enough, this was a case where the interior lines of the Confederacy, from a communication standpoint, were absolutely superb, and Sherman's were really very, very old-fashioned. Hood was in contact with his troops in Jonesboro with a railroad line that just was totally in his control. It was very short. He had a telegraph. He had runners. He had whatever. He had nearly perfect real-time communications with his people in Jonesboro. Sherman had none of that. Okay? He sort of reversed the situation from Fredericksburg. But Sherman was in great communications with his troops as they were running all around, big end run around the western part of Atlanta, and basically cut the railroad in Jonesboro. And the Confederates basically had to evacuate Atlanta because from a food and ordnance standpoint, they could not keep going. Their army would have just shriveled up, as was the case with other sieges.